Welcome, everyone, to the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto's Noon Speaker Series. Today, we are hosting Rachael Myrow and her talk on free speech in the digital age and the mass extinction of American journalism. I'm Nancy Shepard, co-president, and my co-president, Judy Kleinberg, will be welcoming Rachael in a minute. The League of Women Voters envisions a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. The Palo Alto League is an organization that encourages informed and active participation of citizens in government through education. We are a nonpartisan political organization that endorses initiatives, but not political organizations or candidates for office. We are membership-based and invite all of you over the age of 16 to become a member by going to our website, lwvpaloalto.org. This is a webinar. We will all be muted throughout. However, we welcome your questions in the Q&A feature or the chat feature. And now I want to introduce Judy Kleinberg, my co-president, who will be introducing Rachael. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Nancy. So we're thrilled, really thrilled to have Rachael with us today. And I want to give you a little bit of her background so you're as impressed as we all are. Rachael Myrow is a senior editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk, and you can hear her on NPR, The World, WBUR's Here and Now, and the BBC. She also guest hosts for KQED's Forum. Over the years, she's talked with Kamau Bell, David Byrne, Kamala Harris, Tony Kushner, Armistead Maupin, Van Dyke Parks, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Tommy Smith, among so many others. There's quite a list. But before all this, she hosted the California Report for 7.5 years, reporting on topics like assisted living facilities, the robot takeover at Amazon, and chocolate persimmons. I don't know if we'll have time to hear about that. She's won numerous awards for her work and holds a degree in English and journalism from UC Berkeley. Outside of the studio, Rachael likes to hike our Bay Area trails and whips up Instagram-ready meals in her kitchen. Maybe that's where those chocolate persimmons come from. So we're delighted, Rachael, you can join us. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am so glad to talk with you today. Can I tell you? I mean, I've been waiting for this. As a journalist, I write for you, this audience. You're the people I imagine when I'm putting my stories together, when I'm asking questions of the powerful on your behalf. You're the engaged voter, the educated voter. Did you see Nancy's t-shirt? Democracy is not a spectator sport. Precious and few are the moments we can share like this. Also, there needs to be more of us. So let's talk about it today. You know, the last few days, as I've been writing these remarks, I've been asking myself what I can do for you, what journey we can take today, what I can share with you about this moment we're in, this political, this cultural, this economic moment. So today we're going to cover how we got here, what here looks like, and what we in this Zoom room can do about it. This talk is called Free Speech in the Digital Age, which is what the League told me this audience wants to hear about. Also, the election and the disinformation that we're experiencing in a nonpartisan kind of way. And hey, with such sophisticated questions, I recognize that many of you in this crowd probably already know the territory, but I'm going to cover some basics too, to bring along those who maybe need a little backstory. And I should mention as we dig into this that I'm going to stop about 40 minutes in to leave time for your questions. So please, as you think of them, pop them into the Q&A box. Well, to start with, across the political spectrum here in the United States, there seems to be a growing disillusionment with free speech, the principle of free speech, the basic concept. That is to say, I'm all for free speech for me, but for you, no. Only if you agree with me. And I do mean on every single political and cultural issue, down to what sports team I think it's okay for you to support, what clothes you wear, what food you eat, what pronouns you use, what God you worship. That's if I believe you're even allowed to worship a God. Agree with me on 8 out of 10 propositions? Not good enough, right? Left and right, politically speaking. That's even though different people will have different ideas about various issues of the day and what should be done about them all. That's just an incontrovertible truth about humans, not just Americans. Our democracy with a small d doesn't require that we all think alike. It can't. What it can do is provide a structural framework for hashing out compromises. But too many of us are so rigid that we've come to see all compromise as unacceptable. That's the state of things now. It's unpleasant and it's also toxic. It's toxic to us as human beings and toxic for our nation. So, one of the arguments I'll be making today is that freedom of speech starts with us. It's not just a top-down thing delineated by governments or universities or social media platforms. Individually, we've got to be okay with differences of political opinion. I'm not saying embrace the unacceptable. Remember, I cover hate speech and disinformation on a daily basis. I have for years. As a journalist and as a human being, I believe it's never okay to advocate for physical harm to others. What I am saying is that we must somehow find our way back to tolerating the inescapable fact that other people don't think as we do on a host of topics. And it has to be okay for them to talk about it with us, okay to disagree, okay to protest, not okay to harass, but okay to make a noise. So let's get these slides started, and hopefully you'll be able to see me in the at least half of the screen. All right, so we'll go back here. All right. So I spend, perhaps like you, a big part of each day on a variety of social media platforms and on a variety of news sites, trying to keep my head above the rising tide of misinformation and disinformation. And for those of you who might be unclear on the difference between the two, the dividing line has to do with intent. So misinformation is spread unintentionally, disinformation is intentionally spread. And while this is scary stuff to pay close attention to, what really scares me, what really keeps me up at night is the decline of news. That's what scares me. And I'll tell you why. Because journalism is a structural pillar of a healthy democracy. If we lose journalism, if we allow the news industry to crumble, we're going to lose the democracy. So I want to warn you as we get started today that I'm here with a big ask, capital B, capital A. No, I'm not asking you to head to kqed.org/donate and give big for KQED. I know some of you already give, and I want to thank those of you who do. No, I'm here to ask you to do something really uncomfortable. I'm going to ask you to lean into news consumption in a big way to save it. Why is this my ask? Because you have to be an informed voter to save democracy. It's that simple. If there's any hope, it's coming from you. Hope looks like us right here in this Zoom room. You, me, us, informed. And you and me, the guardians of free speech. So if you're not nervous yet, you haven't been listening to me these last few minutes. You know, as this crowd no doubt knows by heart, free speech is enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. You can whisper it under your breath with me if you remember the words. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. And yes, I know the history mavens in this crowd are probably thinking, Congress has contravened the rules in the past, but not recently. So How is it we've gotten to an existential moment for journalism? Let's talk first about original intent. The admittedly privileged white men who hashed out the Constitution were quite specific about their greatest fear. Remember, this is the First Amendment. So what were they afraid of? That after the blood and treasure spilled in the War of Independence, another privileged white man would rise up in their lifetimes and proclaim himself king, right after they'd gone to great trouble to free themselves of a tyrant. The framers of the Constitution grasped that in order to have a government accountable to the people, well, accountable to the privileged white men of their day, they had to enshrine freedom of speech in the very spiritual bedrock of this nation, and a free press. Freedom of speech for everybody? Speech of every kind? If you know something about the press of their day, of the 18th century, you know the press was red in tooth and claw, ferocious, divisive. But the outer edges of what's acceptable to publish would stretch in the many years that followed. And thank goodness for that, for generations of activists who forced these changes, that expansion of public discourse at great trouble and sacrifice. And I think it must be said, not primarily for their benefit, but the benefit of generations that came after, for the benefit of us, people like us. We're indebted to these activists. Because of them, we're allowed by law to ask the biggest questions you can ask in a democracy. How heavy do we want the hand of government to be? How heavy the hand of religion, private corporations, wealthy oligarchs, celebrities, activists? We collectively have a right to ask. Do you have a right to question public health officials during a pandemic? You do. What if they don't really know what they're doing at the time, or they change their minds midstream? You still do. Do you have a right to pick a side in a military conflict here in the US, abroad? The biggest questions we have a right to ask, even if we annoy the most powerful people in this country, or cost them power, or money, or both. We have a right to ask. The laws of this land say so. So why is it not so clear lately? Why are we seeing so many people, regular people, rank and file people, judging others so ferociously and saying, my arguments must be broadcast to the ends of the earth, but you need to shut up, right? Have I got it? Why are we so busy policing each other? I think one reason that you'll all agree with is that we've been bamboozled into doing the dirty work of politicians. Are social media platforms in cahoots with Democratic-led governments and left-leaning academic researchers to censor conservative political opinions? That's a claim Silicon Valley insiders have debunked repeatedly. And you can find a lot of these ostensibly censored opinions all over the internet and all over major social media platforms, and the smaller ones too. I consider this particular line of argument, that opinions are being censored, to be the proverbial froth on the wave of a much bigger problem. One that the social media platforms have created, and also, okay, maybe they didn't create this particular problem, but they poured gasoline all over it and they lit a match. So again, I ask, what is the principle? Why is the principle of freedom of speech not so clear lately? I think most of us recognize that hate speech and disinformation pollutes the quality of a conversation on a platform. Unless, of course, you're online for the hate speech. And I don't think that's this crowd. Who thinks Twitter, I mean X, is a more fun, engaging, vital platform these days after Elon Musk took over and gutted the content moderation department? I can't see you actually on this Zoom, but I'm going to guess that I'm not seeing too many hands up. But I don't want to pin all the blame on Musk or the rest of the social media barons. Have you noticed how Zuckerberg apologizes a lot? Musk does not. In fact, he often countersues or sues originally, but they both continue to make decisions that do a lot more than accommodate harassment and hate speech, slander, and incitement to violence. I think this crowd gets that now, right? This is not a bug, it's a feature. And today, artificial intelligence is making it ridiculously easy for all sorts of people with bad intent to post fake or misleading photos or videos, or real photos and videos that have been miscontextualized with very real world consequences, which hopefully you're seeing on the slide right now. So where are the laws that are supposed to be governing what's said or not said online? Would you believe that most of the court cases that define the First Amendment as we understand it today were decided something like 50 years ago? If you were alive when they were decided, you might have been in diapers or learning to ride a bicycle. In part, the courts and the laws are so far behind the times because technology changes at a speed much, much faster than these deliberative frameworks figured out right in the 18th century were designed to respond to. But that's not all of what's happening here. The US Supreme Court is expected to weigh in on free speech this year. But as is often the case when there hasn't been much recent congressional legislation on the topic, the High Court is in an awkward position. All it can do is come at some really big quandaries from the side rather than head on. And I'll give you an example. Is a social media platform like a news organization? No. Kinda, but not really. No. So where is Congress? Ever notice how Congress never seems to get anywhere with legislation? No matter how explosive the hearing, all the CEOs lined up saying, I'm sorry, or I don't recall. Francis Haig's jaw-dropping testimony. Children we know targeted on social media. Months later, years later, nothing. How is that? I don't think I need to tell you that Silicon Valley companies spend a lot on lobbying and lawyers. You're not surprised by that, I'm going to guess. You know the score. This actually isn't really about partisan politics, although it often seems that way because big tech is on both sides of the deal, right? So back to the idea the rest of us are paddling furiously to keep our heads above water. In this story, I talked to Scott Schaefer's father-in-law. Some of you might know the name. Scott Schaefer is one of my colleagues at KQED, a very fabulous journalist. Well, let me read you a quote from this story. I'm by myself. I don't have anybody nearby I can say, hey, what you think of this? And the person who's speaking is a retired journalist in Pinole, a man named Thomas Kennedy. He could have picked up the phone, but he didn't think to in the moment that he was being scammed. He was saved by a rideshare driver while on his way to get the gift cards for the scammers. Now, Thomas is no dummy, and his family loves him. But Thomas was almost scammed again a few weeks later, even after the embarrassment of knowing he'd been had. Could be cognitive decline, given his age, 81, probably a factor. You'll hear a lot about how gullible older people are these days. But have you noticed that you hear a lot about how gullible younger people are too? And there are studies that show that cognitive decline affects anyone who spends a lot of time online, which of course means me too. That means my reporting is actually personal. It's about what keeps me up at night. So here's a few factoids for you. The latest Federal Trade Commission data, consumers reported losing more than $10 billion to fraud last year. $10 billion. I feel like Carl Sagan. Billion with a B. That's an all-time high. And that's probably not the entirety of it, because you know there are people who didn't report. So I guess perhaps in your own mind, raise your hand right now if you think you know somebody who has fallen for a scam in recent years. Remember Thomas from Pinole? Keep it raised if that person you're thinking about lost more than $10,000, $20,000. I know somebody. I know somebody in my family. Are you feeling the same chill down your spine I'm feeling down mine? There's a growing number of scientific studies that suggest we're swimming in a sea of competing narratives, confusion, and it makes it hard for people of all ages to figure out what's going on. Old, young, we're kind of losing the plot. We don't know which end is up. We're in trouble, personally and politically. Or maybe I'm failing to read this room. I am, of course, talking to some of the smartest, best educated people in the Bay. So surely none of you are confused, but maybe your family members are confused. Maybe one relative in particular you're thinking about right now, maybe two or more. I can think of more than one myself, which is to say that we're all a lot more vulnerable because it's becoming unclear what's real and what's not. And that's thanks to social media declaring itself the convener of our public conversations, of our political conversations. These kind of public commons are loud, chaotic, and toxic places. They're toxic for us as humans. They're toxic for our democracy. So you can see how enthusiastic I am about the fact that, given what I cover, I have to spend a lot of time on these platforms. Yay for me. But yeah, it's my job. And some of you literally pay for me to do this job. And not just because I work at a public media outlet, it's one of the reasons you can trust, though, that I'm your ally, that I'm not the ally of tech titans or politicians on either side of the aisle. Speaking broadly, this is why you want to get your news from journalists and not politicians or advertisers or celebrity influences. So back to the absence of congressional action. Our lawmakers have ceded authority about deciding what free speech is to the big tech companies that build the smartphones and the AI, to the corporate drive for profit that runs the social media platforms. And thanks to gobs of money spent on lobbying in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento and elsewhere, Silicon Valley has surrounded itself with layers and layers of legal bubble wrap. This is how you get bizarre congressional debates like not quite on point questions. Should we just ban TikTok and its sister apps? And any future foreign adversary that's controlling a social network that might come along in TikTok's wake to do the same thing. Never mind what's happening on the other platforms, just the Chinese-owned companies. Why is it happening this way? Say it with me now. ByteDance is an easier political target, the platform most popular with children, and children don't vote. Imagine if Congress decided to ban one brand of cigarettes or just one oil company. It's an odd way to go about legislating. Why not set some legislative guardrails on all of social media? But I imagine some of you are thinking right now, Rachel, isn't Silicon Valley libertarian more than anything else? Can't we trust that the profit motive will ensure lots of people want to eat the lunch of the companies that happen to be big right now? They won't be big forever. I mean, look at generative AI. Every Silicon Valley company is scrambling right now. And you'd be right. But have you noticed we're still on social media platforms of one kind or another? Platforms that are still dominated by companies that make much of their money from advertising and fraudsters and foreign political operatives. Platforms that are killing the news business. It's in a death spiral, and not because it's lost its utility as a structural pillar of democracy. So you can see there's a reason I'm talking to you today, the League of Women Voters today, because we as informed voters are in a position to pop the bubble wrap. Hope looks like us when we activate. That is to say, when we retake control of our conscious attention to the matters at hand and vote. Is this a big ask? Yes, it is. I'll acknowledge that. And I thank you for bearing with me and listening to this because I know you're overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed too. And I know some of you might be thinking, oh, come on, Rachel, you people are always crying wolf. I've got more news coming at me on my phone 24/7 than I can handle. I'm not discounting your experience. What I'm warning you is that where we are right now is like a wet year late into a mega drought. The larger trend lines point to climate change. Just because some monarch butterflies are still landing on the milkweed in front of your yard right now doesn't mean you can rest easy about the news business in America. Some of you might be thinking there's got to be a statute of limitations for the media whining about how the internet stole the ad money and the classifieds and the sports listings and the stock listings. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not sure most people can tell the difference anymore between solid journalism and ad-powered clickbait or propaganda or disinformation, because social media platforms have trained most of us off high-integrity journalism and onto fast food style entertainment, the sexiest stories, crime, personal health, celebrities, sports, delivered for outrage or fear or laughter or some combination thereof. Not you, of course, not me, but people we know. And I'm not asking you to banish fun from your feeds, not at all. But I'm asking you to remember that a lot of responsible news doesn't look like entertainment because it can't. Not just because a lot of journalists are lousy readers or lousy writers. I'm an editor too here at KQED, and I know on an intimate level how much bad writing there is out there. But a lot of the news is lousy because the subject matter is lousy. It's awful stuff. It's complicated. It's opaque. For this kind of bad news, I want to say don't shoot the messenger. Don't overthink the delivery. If you're not living with the discomfort of unresolved conflicts, complicated stories, you're not reading hard news, right? It's hard for a reason. But the expectation that it should be easier, funnier, funner comes from social media, which, let's be honest, isn't designed to protect our democracy. It's designed to sell you stuff and to keep you distracted and ignorant, because then it's easier to sell you stuff. And I think you know that. That is not because these platforms are evil in the capital E sense. The algorithms tell the bean counters and the advertisers that most of us would much rather watch a fun, outrageous celebrity influencer than some wonky, stiff, smarter than you journalist. So over time, thanks to their algorithms, what we all get is the illusion of choice as opposed to actual choice. Bear with me here. I read a lot of news every day, and I'm telling you, I have to work at making sure I'm only consuming high integrity journalism. I'm a smart person and I'm talking to smart people. We're all smart in this Zoom room here. What I'm saying is there are a lot of people trying to manipulate us, to degrade the quality of our attention, to confuse us, to disempower us and the people who rely on us, our family members. So increasingly, news is dominated by people like Joe Rogan instead of people like Christiane Amanpour, because people like her can't fight the algorithms on social media. Have you noticed? You might like Christiane, you might follow her, but you have to go looking for her. She doesn't pop up in your feeds as often as she used to. You know that old adage, you don't know what you don't know? That's the internet we're living in today. And it's designed in such a way that it helps you to think you're choosing to bend away from traditional news. The problem must be with the news. The problem must be with you. The truth is, you actually haven't been offered the choice in the way that you should be. High integrity journalism has become an off-menu option. You have to know to ask for it. All of this has reduced the number of journalists like myself paid to provide the world with a clear factual understanding of what is actually going on. And in this vacuum, we're blown this way and that with competing narratives that are difficult, if not impossible, to verify. Worse, there's no consensus on objective reality. What is freedom of speech? Define freedom. Define speech. Our news landscape is starting to look a lot like other countries where propaganda reigns, rules. China, Brazil, Russia. These media landscapes have been flattened in recent years, freed of their truth tellers. Many of their journalists have moved abroad and report now from exile, but without salaries, they're not going to be able to watchdog from afar for very long. One reporter recently told the International Journalist Network, if you interview me in a year, I might tell you I'm doing deliveries. But that's something you might hear from a lot of journalists in the US in the near future for different reasons, because what we have here now is a kind of public commons built to put advertising first rather than citizens first. So as a result, we all seem to be unclear on what it means to enforce or uphold free speech, because these kind of public forums where we discuss contentious topics of the day have become so chaotic, so mixed up with Silicon Valley's turbocharged drive for profit. You don't need me to tell you that greed is amoral. It doesn't care if your social media feeds are detaching you from your democracy. The platforms we spend so much of our time on now are dominated by people who have figured out how to weaponize the platforms to serve their own ends. You know the definition of nihilism, the rejection of all moral principles, the belief that life is meaningless. Question those feelings when they strike, challenge them. Who or what is asking me to feel this way, and why? I'd argue the profit-seeking nihilism of Silicon Valley is the driving force behind how social media platforms build your feeds, not political or cultural censorship. Unless you spend time carefully manicuring your newsfeed, the arc of the news you see bends towards outrage and confusion. Your social media feeds are detaching you from your democracy, not just on Facebook, Meta, Substack, YouTube, Pinterest, Twitter, X. I'm sure I haven't mentioned all of them, but they all make money by platforming voices that stoke outrage and fear. And I'll be honest, a lot of news organizations now do too, because they're trying to compete with that noise. It's a mess. If previous technological transitions did a lot to shorten our attention spans, the transition to social media has altered our basic expectation of what news should be, of what hard news should be. I'm talking about the kind of news that keeps citizens informed about the issues and the candidates that we may well be asked to vote on. Remember, we're talking about our democracy, so that's where the vote comes in. Social media has trained us to expect that kind of news to compete with entertainment. We expect news now to be as short and as punchy as a comedian's stand-up routine. All props to John Oliver and The Daily Show. I'm a big fan of both. But I just want to check in with the fans under 40 here to make absolutely sure you all understand where those shows are getting their raw material. Because if you don't understand that this comedy builds on original reporting, you're probably not going to support the cost of that original reporting. And eventually, the original reporting goes away. First come the layoffs. You've seen those headlines. Then the companies collapse. Right? Then the companies collapse. Granted, there's always been celebrity gossip going back to ancient times, conspiracy theories, and you'd be right to question me about that. But the internet in general and social media in particular, and AI for sure, amplify the worst of human communications. You'd be right to point out that there's a lot of bad news out there, biased, lazy, the kind of stuff that just makes you think the whole newsroom must be bad. How many of you have decided to dial your news consumption back? I feel you. I can't tell you how many people come up to me at public functions or if at family gatherings, come up to me in the kitchen, and they tell me they've decided to lean out of news consumption on social media to preserve their sanity and really their will to live. It's like I'm a Roman Catholic priest and they're confessing. They want my sympathy, they want my absolution. And I do feel sympathy because so much of the news, even the responsibly reported news, is just so depressing and dire all of the time. No offense, but writing off journalism altogether because some of it is imperfect and even problematic is like deciding that because some clothes are poorly designed, you're not going to pay for clothes anymore and maybe even run around naked outside the home. Newsflash, this is the Bay Area. It's breezy. I'm telling you to at least put on a sweater. So there's truth to all the criticisms about journalism, or most of them anyway. The problem is when Americans abandon news media altogether, we discount the good, the structural good in journalism that hasn't been replaced by podcasts and social media. And it can't be replaced by them because they're designed to do different things. Their ambitions are different. Journalism is a structural pillar in a healthy democracy. Lose it, allow it to crumble, and we lose the democracy. If nobody is watching all the various levels of government, business, schools, law enforcement, utilities, healthcare, with an eye to the public interest, those stories won't get told. Who's going to pay for that kind of coverage other than you? Not government, businesses, schools, law enforcement. They aren't going to pay for it because bugs under a rock want to stay hidden under that rock. But we're talking about our schools and our drinking water and our law enforcement. And not to put too fine a point on it, but most of the people in charge in Silicon Valley are still privileged white men. And whether or not Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or fill in the blank tech exec intend to run oppressive, exploitative, corrosive to democracy platforms, what they are doing is exactly that. That's why I'm suggesting that over-focusing on whether one individual or one post gets kicked off this platform or redirects our attention away from the big story, the nihilism underpinning all of social media, right? That's what I'm talking about today. TikTok is not the only hot mess. So I recognize now that I'm running a little longer than I anticipated. So I'm going to abbreviate things here. I'll just say close to closing, the companies say we don't want to be the gatekeepers to public discourse, but they are. And now mix in generative AI and you have what exactly looks like a hot mess. But squint and you can see clearly that there are winners and there are losers in this attention economy. It's not a bug, it's a feature, right? So you see this slide here from John Perry Barlow. Just want to remind you of the optimism many of us had in the 1990s. And then even in the aughts, as things started to look a little different. Some of us used to worship Silicon Valley startup founders back when they were startup founders. But I think it's become clear that what's developed is something that it's a party we're not invited to, right? It's happening on some private Hawaiian estate, or maybe in a few years it's going to happen on Mars. But we're not invited to it. So back to reality, what can we do? I'm going to offer a short list of honeydew items that you're free to accomplish in whatever way you want. But I'm hoping that you're going to take these basic concepts to heart because I believe we have a short window of opportunity to turn away from the hot mess we're living in and reclaim the public conversation. So number one, build a news feed. If you haven't already, take back possession of your consciousness by curating what you expose yourself to on a daily basis. Read strategically, right? So cultivate a diversified blend of news. Make sure you're exposing yourself to different viewpoints, starting with different choices about what's important to cover and why. Number two, pay for what you can. Seriously, How many of you are paying for streaming entertainment you used to get for free or close to for free? So if then, why not news? The case is not closed. Pay for it. Even the private stuff, not just KQED. 3, vote. Continue to vote. Continue to encourage others as well. It's that simple. It's that basic. It really comes down to what I said earlier. Hope looks like us. Remember how I said that at the very beginning? Either we hold our politicians and our regulators accountable, either we insist that they do more to protect us from the profit-seeking nihilism of Silicon Valley, or we lose the whole damn country. And you know as well as I do that accountability starts at the ballot box. It starts with educated voters like yourself, bringing in others like yourself to change the tenor of the public conversation, to be civil society warriors. As I said earlier, we don't have a choice. If we lean out now, there will be no leaning in later. We're in a dark place, but I'm not hopeless about it because of you, because of all of you, who you are, what motivates you. So I'm going to say that famous phrase, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? Hope looks like us. And with that, I'm going to head over to questions. All right, here we go. Heather says, hello, Rachel. Thank you for your time. I produce svtags.org. It's a TV show, educational website on 20 public stations in the Bay Area. Been doing this for a stretch. Our mission is to share information about companies, nonprofits, people, and places concerning technology, art. What do you think? Here's your question. What do you think of KGO going off air so that a free good news program is not available on AM radio, or those who may not have access to podcasts or paid Sirius, etc.? Well, I'll admit, Heather, I didn't listen to KGO quite often, but I know people who did. And I think it's part of the mass die-off of news that we're talking about. There's a lot of it's a lot of the small companies. It's a lot of the medium companies. There are fewer and fewer big companies. And the problem with just leaving it to the New York Times and the Washington Post, even though they do a pretty decent job, is that they're primarily focused on national and international stuff. And you have to have a diversified portfolio of local news organizations. And that's why it's so critical for us as people who live in California to be consuming and to be paying for local and regional news. There's no other way. There really is no other way. So I would just say that. Okay, we've got here, all right.
All right. Well, I think that was the
Yeah.
only written question, Rachel. We're waiting for some more. And
We're
while we
waiting
wait
for a
some
few
more-
others.
Yeah, well,
I will go back to here. You know what? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Here we go. Oh, I see. I was
all right, we can
already.
see you. You look
You can
great.
see me. All right,
So-
that's good to go.
So
Yeah.
while we wait for others, let's see, so we do have another question. The question is,
good.
are you afraid of the spoiler effect in voting in California and the United States? Can you comment on ranked choice voting? It's controversial.
Yeah, ranked choice voting has been interesting. We've had an opportunity to kind of watch it the last few years. And the funny thing, this has, whenever you sort of tweak the system, it creates a solve to some issues and it creates new issues. I think it's been very illuminating for us to see how it highlights some very big structural problems in our democracy, right? So it encourages people to play to the extremes the whole way through the year. It encourages people to do iffy things like, support. We have these safe districts, right? So let's say you take a district here in California, it's likely to be a safe Democratic district. What you should see, what the whole idea with ranked choice was like to get people to have a nice, robust, debate going on between top candidates for any particular position. But, instead what you see a lot of is, oh, I don't know, Adam Schiff, for instance, supporting the Republican candidate because the Republican candidate would be easier to run against in November. Right. And he's not the only one, right? Like that's something I hope you pick up with this hour. I'm always thinking, what is this individual doing as a function of where they are in the system, as opposed to like, oh, this person is bad, or this person is amoral, or that strategy is amoral. It's often a sign of how the system is working or not working.
Great, great answer. Well, while we wait for a few more, I'll throw one out. Doesn't any regulation of online platforms like blogs or podcasts and social media in general endanger all of free speech?
It's a good question, right? Because you get back to these companies saying, look, we don't want to be the gatekeepers. And there are they make a lot of mistakes. They're not even trying, right? Have you noticed how a lot of these platforms have just said, we're not even going to focus on news in this election year because y'all are criticizing us and it's too much. Or, previously, we're going to try to figure this out at scale, Mark Zuckerberg likes to say. So let's use algorithms. And the algorithms get a lot of stuff wrong. I think there has to be a way for platforms like Meta's platforms to engage with regulators, right? There's a constant back and forth between regulators and all kinds of industries where they might have an argument that they have in administrative law courts, or it's an argument that makes it to state or federal court. They hash it out. Here's what you're doing that is making it impossible for us to give a particular group of people a voice, or perhaps that particular group of people sues collectively to force the conversation, maybe now with the government instead of the platform, which it has to follow a certain law. But I think, when we first saw the laws set up, the section I'm thinking of, that basically said, oh, leave these little internet startups alone. They'll be crushed if we try to regulate them. They're big now. They can handle it. We can all, as a democratic society, handle more of the rough and tumble. It's a fight that would play out over multiple years, but I think we can all handle it.
Thank you for that answer. Let me throw another one out that I think is such a hot topic. I know when I Google something now, the first answer is generative AI. It's labeled that way. I know that Senator Josh Becker has proposed some legislation in California that would label AI answers. Don't know where that's going to go. But what do you think about AI? I mean, the scale of worry is from, I'm not worried at all because I'm smart, I can figure it out, to, oh my gosh, I can't count on anything anymore.
Yeah, I feel all of that. I have all the feels, including the positive feels. Like I'm going to be very curious to see what wonderful things emerge from this technology. But I gotta say, the information or disinformation vortex is about to get really bad because the AIs, these different software systems, they talk to themselves and they hallucinate. And it's just going to become a maelstrom equaled in our history, in our human history. I think the idea of labeling AI product or requiring that it's labeled is good. It's probably not going to solve everything, but it's a good step forward. I was just listening to a conversation with the UC Berkeley computer scientist Hani Farid, who has a lot of great things to say. And one of the things he suggests is a kind of watermarking, a digital watermarking, so that we can sort of follow who created this.
So another quick question. Do you see young people interested in going into journalism, or are they completely turned off?
Journalists, I don't know, maybe it's some kind of a disease in in the blood. Whether we're born with it or raised with it, there's always hungry, smart, earnest people who want to get into this business for the right reasons. Like the movies always, TV shows always show journalists as, being fame hungry, money hungry people who are, in it for personal aggrandizement. And there's some of it there. But I got to say, we have regular internship programs at KQED. And 3 times a year, I am reminded that there are wonderful people coming up after me. And that's another thing that gives me a great deal of hope.
Do you think that our public schools, we can't control our private schools, but do you think our public schools should do more education to alert the young people about make some discerned decisions about what they're reading and what they're learning and how to make those decisions, as you say, have a wide variety of sources. But what do you think about educating kids in school so that they're ready to make those decisions?
I think that's already happening in private schools as well as public. There are a lot of teachers out there who are helping kids use technology to address assignments in ways that I can't even imagine. Right? When I went to school, it was all paper and pencil. But there's no point in leaving pedagogy unchanged to what it was, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. You want to teach the children how to use the technology for their own purposes and how to be sophisticated consumers of information coming at them. The problem is, what I mentioned earlier, these sort of weaponized modes of miscommunication, especially for teenagers who are starting to feel skeptic about every adult, everybody over 21. They're often they're at risk of being bamboozled by grown-ups who are very sophisticated in the way that they're presenting their communication, as opposed to parents who tend to say, you listen here, young man, you go to your room until you figure out why you're not allowed to do XYZ.
So one quick back to a previous question, somebody was asking, what about regulating hate speech? It's a real big problem now.
Yeah, it is a big problem. And I go back to the idea that I think we have a system that is robust enough to handle regulators trying to step in. You see it in Europe. They're setting the path forward. And there are a lot of problems there, and the bureaucracy coming out of Brussels, there's a lot of complaints, and but they're in conversation with Silicon Valley directly, and going at it. There are court cases and administrative reviews and lobbyists, and they are doing a lot more than we are over here, to try and clean up the platforms. And it's interesting to me to see the ways that these really big companies, they're wealthy enough, they can hire enough people, they can operate a cleaner system for people in Europe than they're operating here in the US or elsewhere around the world. So if they can do it for Europe, why can't they clean it up for us here too?
So you've mentioned an awful lot of concerns that we all share about the condition, the situation with journalism. What about journalists themselves? There have been pretty overt threats in this country by some, I'll call them thought leaders, be very general. What are you experiencing, and what are your colleagues experiencing in terms of being able to be a free speech journalist?
There's all sorts of contexts. I have not personally been attacked. I know people who have been either digitally attacked, doxxed, ridiculed in public forums, physically attacked. And the part of the problem is that you just don't know where the attack is going to come from. For instance, I'm thinking of somebody very dear to me who reports in Southern California attending a protest. This was during the pandemic, shot in the neck by a law enforcement officer with a rubber bullet. A law enforcement officer. A lot of the attacks in the US against journalists come from law enforcement. And I don't think it's the policy of that particular law enforcement agency to target journalists, but there are a lot of individuals in the US who just feel so powerfully that they are in a righteous place and the person who disagrees with them or might be suspected of disagreeing with them, right? Like this is thought like, journalists, they're rooting for the other side, and that makes it okay to target them. And that's the problem, to my mind, right? Like we've all kind of got to restore a mature sense of how a democracy operates.
So somebody in the Q&A mentioned a show that I love too, Alaska Daily with Hilary Swank, which wasn't renewed again, but it was, that exact scenario, which is journalists fighting City Hall to get the truth out. I thought it was a wonderful show. Somebody, Sean Gilbert here, thought so too. It also portrayed the effort to reveal some very hard truths about the way Native American women were treated. And then, of course, we have the Osage movie that just happened. We need journalists to peel away all of that governmental onion skin and see the truth. So let me give you the last word. What gives you optimism about the internet and social media and free speech for journalists?
Well,
aside from us.
yeah, it's like Musk. My optimism, as I said earlier, doesn't really stem from the platforms themselves. And I want to say, as a journalist, I get introduced to sources. I'm able to share my stories. There's a lot of wonderful things that social media provides, and it can provide an opportunity to build community. But what gives me hope is really the people in this Zoom room. So right, like we somehow collectively and individually have to find a way to insist that these companies do better. It's very hard to do that directly. It's often easier to do it through government, which I know is not a big, not an easy ask, right? But somehow we have to use the powers already given to us as voters and as consumers to push back and insist that this world be shaped more to our liking than the liking of those who are in power.
Wonderful. I love that sentiment. So, Rachel, thank you so much for your insights about the state of free speech and journalism in America today. And thank you for everyone out there on Zoom who's joined us today. For our members, please save the date for our annual meeting, Sunday, May 19th, for a lunch. It's a lunch meeting starting at 12:30 at the Baylands Golf Links restaurant. And if you've tuned in here and you're not a member and care about being a guardian of free speech and free press, as Rachael pleaded in her presentation, join us as a member. Go to lwvpaloalto.org and join a group of like-minded people helping preserve our democracy. Remember, as our motto, democracy is not a spectator sport. Again, that's lwvpaloalto.org. And we hope to see you as a member, but if not, tune into these events, which we do as public service. And thanks to everyone, especially Rachael Myrow.
Thank you for having me.